personality traits.
No, I think I know what you're asking. What you're saying is that sometimes some of your selves are going to do things that you think are really bad, and the tendency is going to be
or
to like judge them and castigate them and not
on.
let that self ever have its time out. And is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm asking, like, okay, so say, you know, a rebellious side of yourself shows up and wants to, you know, throw caution to the wind, but, you know, hey, that's an illegal act and you may get thrown in jail. How do you look at this from a place of kind of reining in the outrageous, if it's outrageous? I mean, I'm not saying, because some multiple selves have Uzis and AKs, you know, whatever, you know?
Yeah, no. I understand what you're asking. And it's a really good question. And so there's a few different levels. One level is you will have selves that you want to judge and feel bad at. We have a part in the book by a friend of mine named Kintla Stryker. She works in Michigan with social justice system and yoga on people who have severe trauma. And she describes a technique called loving them all up into the whole. So on some level, you really do have to find a way to love each of yourselves, even the recalcitrant ones that seem to want to do things that are really bad. In the book, we tell a story about me forgetting something and me labeling one of my selves in a negative way, and then Jim gave me some advice, which was, you know, you don't want to sort of freeze that self with negative language. You know, you want to find a way to communicate with it and to find something that it can live with. In fact, there's a story in the book about a friend of Jim's who had a severe porno addiction, and they had some correspondence, and he worked through with him, you know, what he could do with that self. So the first point is that when you know your other self is real and it presents a real challenge, that's a good place to begin, right? You actually have this problem.
Sure.
Second, when you start realizing that you have different selves, in the book we talk about a few people who describe the fact that the very act of thinking about the different selves and what they would have to say to each other seems to open up a line of communication and healing. And then you have to, you know, negotiate and find ways of working with the recalcitrant selves, the ones that are going to eat too much or do a bad thing or say something they shouldn't. And you have to, you know, negotiate and discuss and find a way of working with them and find a way of letting them have some of what it is that they need or want in the world. And when you let out sort of a bad self occasionally and let it do its thing, they're so grateful. So another distinction in the book is made between being a bad dog and having a bad dog. Yeah, you have a bad dog. I have a couple of bad dogs. You know, there's no question. And sometimes they get out and they wreak havoc, and I work with them. But, you know, knowing that they're real is the place you have to start. If you just say, well, you know, I have no explanation for how this feeling came over me and it just happened and I had nothing to do with it. So in a way, this is moving towards a higher level of responsibility. And the other point I wanted to make is that one of our I don't know if it's a breakthrough, but one of our new ideas in the book that you don't really see stated anywhere else is that selves, which we carefully define in terms of self-states, and we work with Charles Tart's definition and several other psychiatrists, selves do not only get created when you're young and under tremendous trauma and stress and sexual abuse and that sort of thing. In the 70s and 80s, when we call them the progressive therapists, began to look at what was then multiple personality disorder and is now dissociative identity disorder, what they said was that this act of being able to dissociate, a word we take to task later on, but when you dissociate and you create this other self, that was an evolutionary adaptation. It prevented the 7-year-old being abused or in real time from going insane and dying, basically. So it's an evolutionary adaptation, and that's an interesting point. But the point that it misses is that many of ourselves come to be not under periods of stress or duress, but in times of great happiness and delight. So I first realized this when I was in Point Charles, which is on the Chesapeake Bay. We had a beach house for like 3 days, and there was nothing to do, and I spent 3 hours the first day in the bay, which is only like 3 feet tall, warm, on a tire, on an inner tube, kind of floating and spinning my legs around and being in the sand. I mean, I spent a lot of time there, and then I remembered that I used to do this when I was 4 and 5 years old at the beach club I went to 6 out of 7 days a week every summer. My lolling in the mud and being really happy and present and looking at the waves and loving life self, that formed when I was 4 years old. It's a positive event. And later on, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, I had a bike accident. It wasn't terrible, but I went, head over heels. And when you see your heels going over your head, it makes you think. And I didn't ride again for a year and a half. I didn't trust my bike. And then eventually part of me spoke up and said, dude, you love bike riding. You've been riding since you were 5. Let's get a new bike. So I got a new bike that fit me properly. And the moment I got on, boom, right back into the 5-year-old self. Sheer delight at, moving through space in the wind, and I'm moving myself. I love bicycles. That's not a negative event. That's my bike-loving part of me, And so when you kind of move it forward, did you create a self that was very happy actually when it's doing what it's doing now and facing the public and speaking with someone? I think you created that. I think people, create ambitious selves or can. And knowing that, you can perhaps put together, let's say, a disciplined exercise part of you that you've never really had. But maybe you can forge that. It just brings open possibilities in so many areas to think this way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It really is. What surprised you the most in your research for the book?
Well, it was doing I did most of the research on this psychology history. So it was finding out how many of these early people knew each other and were connected, learning things like Carl Jung's medical dissertation was on his cousin's case of multiple personality. Did you know that? Probably not. Most people don't. I didn't. Yeah. But also just looking at some of the really creative minds who have tried to describe what's going on here and try to explain, how this could work. So, it was just that there's so much out there, but it didn't really hold together. And so when you really look at it, what I'm good at is taking a huge amount of information and bringing it all together and synthesizing and putting it in one place. And the more we put it in one place, the better it held together. Such to the point that 3 or 4 months before we published, an article came out that we describe in a long footnote. I think her name is Anna Tavas, that kind of reinforced everything we knew about the history, but made it all even more so true. So it's like this is out there. Oh, and here's the other thing that surprised me. In the process of writing the book, I came across a couple of different. I took a course in NVC, nonviolent communication, and my immediate thought in the first 2 lessons was, if Marshall Rosenberg had our idea underneath it, a positive version of psychology rather than the negative one we have now, his system would make a lot more sense, because most of the questions people were asking in the group the first day were all about moving in and out of different selves. And similarly, you see it in Tony Robbins. He distorts it a little, but I dipped into a few hours one of his workshops before I had to leave. And once again, it's like people already use these ideas in a lot of places, and but then at the end of the day, and it's so funny, you see this in Herman Kahneman wrote a book about System 1 and System 2. He won the Nobel Prize for this economics theory. In the intro to the book, he says, I know it sounds like I'm talking about that we have different selves, but of course that can't be, ha, ha, ha. And you have Doug Hofstadter, the famous mathematician and writer, award-winning book writer. He spends dozens of pages dialoguing between his selves and trying to figure this out, right? And at the end of the day, he says, but of course, I must only really have one self, and then ends. So what seems to happen is that no matter who it is, at the end of the day, the single self-assumption kind of swallows them up, and they go, but it can't really be that we have multiple selves, so let me, disclaim and say that's not really the situation.
Well, isn't it also because there's been so much association with it being an imbalance in our psychology, in our consciousness? We haven't supported it since the 1900s, and so why haven't we supported it? It's not looked at as a congruency in our in our
I understand. It's looked at as being quite insane, and what we're saying is that just check it out for yourself.
Right.
Look around.
Right.
Or if you want, take our
Interesting.
tour de force through language, culture, religion, philosophy, postmodernism, and all the rest, and you'll see that, holy cow, this doesn't just hang together.
Right.
It makes more sense of the world. But you're exactly right, which is why when you were saying before, Lisa, that everyone has multiple personalities, that's why we use the word selves. The word multiple personality has too much negativity. In fact, when the publisher first sent us the proposed cover, we love the cover of the book right now. But the first cover they sent us looked like a manual for serial killers that had all sorts of people like shouting with their hands around their faces like an Edward Munch painting. And it was like, when you hear this, what people do is because of the assumption. So the way that Jim has always seen this, it's like we've gone to another island. We've gone onto your island, and what we're seeing is that nobody on your whole island understands this very obvious fact about how people actually are. That was the de facto standard in 1890 in America. So yes, Sigmund Freud ended up burying it, and then Hollywood and book writers super pathologized it. And at this point, it's built right into the foundation of psychological theory, which is why we take the idea of dissociation to task in an appendix. And we say, rather than base psychology on dissociation, which says that you have de facto committed an act of mental pathology if you move from one self, even to a self that's much more appropriate for the coming situation, you've still done an act of pathology. We say, when you look at dissociation, it's a very troubled word for other reasons, which I won't go into here, but then we say, let's build it up. Let's build psychology up on the idea of cohesion instead, how well somebody hangs together. And cohesion, in turn, we break down into congruence, which is, does somebody do what they say they're going to do? Coherence, are they understandable? Can you understand them? And compassion, because what happens is when you realize that you have selves, you become more compassionate to those recalcitrant parts, and you become more compassionate to the people in your life. So when they forget to do something they promised or didn't hear you, it's because that part of them isn't here. So you can get mad at it and rail against it, or you can realize, wow, they're not quite as coherent as I'd like them to be right now.
Right. Now I'm going to ask the final question here in wrapping it up. I'd love to know how all this research and information, because I'm sure, when we learn something new, it's like this a whole light bulb moment, right? It's like, oh, wow, everything now is being seen through a new lens. So how did this affect your personal life or that of your family?
Well, we have a few examples. I give an example of we have some wisteria that grows into a pathway that you need to get from one place to another. And the normal me would have come right up to it, whipped my pocket knife off, and just got rid of it. But I was in the space where I said, I had this thought, which was, what if I was the kind of person who could just relax and smell the flower? And I stopped, and I did, and the desire to cut it off because it was violating what I call the corridor rule, it was completely gone. It seemed absurd. It was this incredibly beautiful wisteria that was smelling amazingly. That's a very minor example. Another example is it's just in the warp and woof of daily relations in my household. I live with my wife and two other adults, and we have for 20 years in the same big house here, and I am just a little less reactive. I'm more likely to realize that I'm moving into the part of me that is going to create the same fight that I always have because, she's moving into the part that I always have the fight with. I can't always see it, but I can see it more than I used to. And another example is that before COVID, I would often find that sometimes at restaurants, people don't see me. Servers don't see me. I get ignored. I'm sitting there way too long. This has to do with the fact that I've built an amazingly good shield so that I'm not seen. So it's my own fault, right? But when that happens, in the past, I would get mad and upset. And even though I was right at the end of the day, I would feel terrible. I'd have terrible hormones running through my body. And now what I do is I get up and I walk myself out. I exit myself. Because I know that even though that seems stupid and I'm already there, it's really a lot better than me devolving into one of the worst parts of who I am because I've been triggered, and it's happened. How many times this has to happen for me to know that it never is a good thing when I let it happen all the way. So I've become
Right.
better at things like that. And, it's just, Jim has a few stories, too, where he talks about, he had a grad student over